Well, it's a great pleasure to be here for many reasons. One, it's enterprise I really applaud. Two, it's not often that you see this many people in a room hearing about philosophy of science. I'm enormously impressed by the intellectual culture of Bristol. And third, being myself working in the southwest of England, I'm particularly welcome the development of the subject in this part of the world and foresee in a very short time that the southwest of England will definitely be the place in the country to come and work on philosophy of science. So I've been asked to talk about philosophy of biology, which obviously is what I do, and so let me start. My title, some of you will be familiar with the quote. Ernest Rutherford, a famous physicist, is said to have said, all of science is either physics or stamp collecting. And I suppose the thought there was a kind of view of the world that I think many scientifically minded people still have. Ultimately, there's nothing to the world but just lots of physical particles. I mean, of course, physics curiously contradicts all of this now, but still, we still tend to think of almost like old Newtonian billiard balls bumping into one another and determining how things are going to turn out. Well, of course, we know it's not like this, but still, I think the image lives on. And in that sort of a world, ultimately, the physics should tell us everything there is. And so we may have to deal, to deal with more complex things, but that's only because we don't know enough, we're not smart enough, our computers aren't big enough, so we do things like collect funny animals and strange stories because we can't really do the physics. Well, of course, I don't think it's like that, but here's a little cartoon I found which nicely illustrates, I think, the sort of the picture that people sometimes have. You know, there's fundamental science, and actually the most fundamental science, of course, is just mathematics, and perhaps physics just is mathematics. But as I say, of course, it's not like that. In philosophy, in my lifetime, when I started doing philosophy of biology some 3 decades ago, it was a pretty eccentric corner of the subject. There were a few people who just, made a little bit of a splash, but it really, people tended to assume that if you wanted to do philosophy of science, you were going to do physics. That was where the important questions were, where the really interesting science was. So I give a little, anecdotal indication of how far we've moved from there, that I was just at the Philosophy of Science Association. It's the big American Association for Philosophy of Science, and I happen to be, be involved with the program committee and found there were actually twice as many papers submitted on biology as physics. Now, of course, that may have just a funny year. I don't mean to say philosophy of physics terribly important, just that philosophy of biology is just as important now, and we're beginning to see, well, we have seen for some time, philosophy of social sciences, philosophy of chemistry, philosophy of psychology, cognitive sciences. It's spreading out, and philosophers are engaging much more specifically with all kinds of different parts of science. And I think this is a really major shift in our field, and a really positive and exciting one in my view. And I want to just reflect a little on what this means. So, and I will just stick from now on with biology. Now, I guess the first thing you might think is, well, perhaps we learn just different things from biology from what we learn from physics and chemistry. The tradition that was just beginning to fade when I started, I should say here, I apologize for the only bit of shameless self-promotion in this talk. I'll get to that in a moment. So when I started, the idea, there was the dominant activity is what is now called general philosophy of science. There are still people who do what would be called general philosophy of science. It has interesting connections with other areas of philosophy, but it was generally the view that what you should do as a philosopher was try and understand concepts like a scientific law. What was causation? What was it to explain something? And I just pick out one of the classic books within that sort of genre, by Karl Hempel, one of the great philosophers of science of the 20th century, who has still enormous influence on our views, particularly on explanation. But a movement that and I, as I say, I do the self-promotion because it is one that I've had some role in, is to actually really argue that perhaps there isn't really such a thing as science at all. Maybe there are really just a lot of different sciences. They have things in common. They have, for example, a commitment to empirical engagement with the world, maybe many other things, maybe concepts that spread across them. But to assume that how you do physics is just the same as how you do molecular biology or ecology or economics is just quite unwarranted. These are very different subject matters, and they call for different ways of approaching them. Now, if that's true, as I believe, then if we want to know what happens in biology, we have to do philosophy of biology. We can't just talk about laws and causes and explanation. And perhaps even more interestingly, and here's another reason why science and philosophy need to mix and meet, is that science can tell us, or certainly should help us to address the big philosophical questions. I say here metaphysics. Surely, if we want a view of what the world's like, we need to look at a science as fundamental as biology. So here's one idea. Philosophy of biology is just an independent and autonomous subject studying biology, trying to understand how biology works, what it tells us. It presumably will answer all kinds of important questions. It may tell us something about ourselves, since we are biological organisms. It may tell us something about life. It's very common now to hear people say that evolution is something we have to understand human nature. This is something philosophers have explored. What's our relation to the rest of nature? Are we unique? What would it mean to enhance ourselves? These are all very topical questions which demand engagement with biology. But here's the other thought that I mentioned, is that biology can tell us something about really the deep structure of what the world is like. Metaphysics and science, I suggest, are really essentially connected through this kind of project. And this is in a certain way a rather stronger claim than the more local autonomous view of philosophy of biology, because here I'm inclined to suggest that in some respects the focus on physics has given us some distinct metaphysical views that might just be wrong, and that attention to biology will tell us something about ways in which they're wrong. And I should say here that for the kind of project I have in mind, what is important is serious attention to biology, and that I think is something that I'm sure unites all the people I know doing philosophy of science here and in my own institution, is that you can't really do this without getting some serious involvement with the science. So here's a question. This is one that I've been interested in for many years. An absolutely fundamental question about the world, going right back to the Greeks, is a question: to what extent are there different kinds of things in the world? Is one of the things science should do find out what kinds of things there are and what makes them those kinds of things? The ancient philosophers often thought that we would find the essences of different kinds of things, the thing about them that made them what they were. And the absolutely classic example of where this vision is often thought to have been worked out is the periodic table of the elements. It looks as if this tells us this, at least within the domain of chemistry, is a complete inventory of the kinds of things they are, and we are inclined to say maybe something like atomic number is the property that makes something, little thing, belong to one of these boxes, nicely portrayed as boxes. This is an exciting, wonderful scientific insight, and certainly, I don't mean to suggest that that isn't right. However, people have often thought, well, that's just what the world is like. It's full of kinds like that, and maybe that's what biological species are like. So here's, sort of equivalent picture from biology, tree of life, or the branching history of evolution. And at the very end of these branches, we have the little twigs that constitute the species that are the sort of equivalent of atomic kinds. Well, I think that for many reasons, this is a misleading picture. And I will mention one that's of particular interest to me at the moment. First of all, something that I just like point out. I'm very interested in microbes. I have a view that a lot of theoretical biology, certainly not a philosophy of biology, has suffered from acting as if we were a sort of typical organism. And of course, nearly all the history of life is just a history of microbes. Nearly everything alive today is a microbe. 90% of the cells in your body are microbes. You know, microbes are the story. Things like us are just a little interesting Baroque ornamentation on top of this story. And just to get a sense of it, you can see in a kind of relatively modern view of the tree of life, multicellular organisms are a little top left-hand corner of the left-hand circle there. Everything else is just microbes. Now, this is drawn as a tree, but the tree picture is enormously problematic. And on the right-hand side is another picture of the relations between microbes. This one draws in a phenomenon that's now becoming more and more well understood, which is the phenomenon of lateral gene transfer. That's to say, microbes spread genes sideways from organisms to often very distantly related organisms. This may happen in other parts of the tree, but it certainly happens a lot in evolutionary time among microbes. So what does this mean? We look at the tree and we think the idea is that this should enable us to trace all the ancestors of the tree down to a common ancestor with anything else, to really give us a pattern that covers the whole history of life. But the sad truth is, with lateral gene transfer, we can end up in lots of different places, because when we trace the history of the ancestors, we come across genes that have come from all kinds of different organisms. And we start to see that maybe there isn't a tree of life at all, maybe there's just a web of interconnected things. And this, it seems to me, is the kind of change in our view of life that is absolutely fundamental and very little appreciated. And I think it's the kind of thing that certainly is of great interest to philosophers trying to form big pictures of how things work. Now, and there are some morals that I would draw from this. There's many ways of dividing organisms into kinds. There are different kinds of organisms, say microbes versus, let's say, birds or mammals, should be classified in different ways. And this contradicts a view that has existed for millennia, that science, empirical investigation of the world, would find an answer to what kind of things there are. Actually, I think the view is that there is no answer to that. There are actually, I would say, different kinds of things that we identify for different purposes that we may have. I can't defend that in full detail here, but I think it's a very plausible conclusion from reflecting on biology. Now, something completely different, and again, I think reflection on the physical sciences has made it very common to think that scientific explanation is about finding mechanisms, and there's something deeply true about this. It's certainly the way many scientists describe what they do. So here's a classical mechanism. Here's something that looks a bit different, but is certainly the sort of thing that biologists describe as a mechanism. Now, I want to just suggest that actually a closer look at biology, particularly very recently emerging biology, tends to make this picture at least a little problematic. So to start off, here are so our organisms themselves, as an obvious place to begin with biological entities, are they machines? Well, no, of course they're not machines, but of course, having said that, one should say, well, what's the analogy between machines and organisms doing? And I just point out to begin with here some obvious differences. If you look at a machine, even if it's a Volvo, eventually the parts will wear out, you replace the parts, eventually it's finished, everything is on a one-way track to disintegration. Organisms, we don't actually know why they come to an end. They are self-sustaining processes. Some of them go on for very long periods of time. All of them pretty much do come to some kind of an end, unless you thinking of microbial lineages as a continuing entity. But for quite different reasons that, as I say, we don't fully understand. So let me now look at some rather more perhaps unfamiliar kind of mechanism. I think classically the sort of thing that people like to describe as a biological mechanism, the sort of thing that contemporary biology is illuminating for us. And this is the entity, the device in cells that separates the chromosomes in the process of cell division. And this is essentially, you can see, it's forming these chains. There are the chromosomes in the middle, and it's pulling them apart so as to produce two sets of unpaired chromosomes that then, of course, form their pairs in familiar ways to biologists. Here are some pictures, and I guess, the first one looks a bit mechanistic. The pictures we take tend to look a lot less mechanistic, a bit more organic, but one shouldn't worry too much about that. So one asks biologists, what are the mechanisms what is the mechanism? What's the mechanism of the formation of this spindle that then separates the chromosomes? Here are some of the answers. Here are some of the things, now I'm not going to go explain what these are, I probably couldn't in some cases, but it turns out that there are actually lots of processes going on, and this certainly may not be all of them, that form these sort of cables, or microtubules, that form this structure and pull the chromosomes apart. Here's, as I say, a number of different things, all of which are happening, and as I say, there may well be other mechanisms. Now, of course, it could be, okay, there's just lots of mechanisms. The interesting thing, though, is that if you actually explore these, you can knock out these mechanisms, any of them, and the spindle will still form. You can knock out the centrosomes, which are the organizing points from which these tubes form, and actually, it'll take a bit longer, but the spindle will still form. And here's what some scientists who have been working on this say about it. The traditional view of the mitotic spindle, apparatus, as a molecular machine which is built through a defined, irreversible set of instructions is gradually being replaced. It can instead be envisaged as a self-regulating dynamic structure where multiple pathways of microtubule generation are spatially and temporally controlled and integrated, constantly talking to one another and modifying the behavior of their microtubules in order to maintain a flexible yet robust steady-state spindle. And note also that there are processes that are degrading these things too. It's a totally dynamic, multiply caused, multiple processes going on to form a stable end result. And I think that, and I'm particularly keen on this quote because people who like to defend the mechanistic view of science will say, well, scientists always talk about mechanisms, so we should talk about them too because we're trying to say what they do. Well, I think increasingly you'll find that even scientists doing very mechanistic-looking biology are having some questions about this. Okay, now I'm coming to an end. I want to just mention some work that I'm doing myself, just to, again, I suppose one does this, and I even mention a couple of sponsors, just because this is work that is really going to happen. And I'm interested in pursuing this kind of concern about mechanism in a particular direction, which is that I have a hypothesis that we need to pay much more attention to the dynamic aspects of biological entities, to use a horrible philosophical weasel word. I think that we tend so easily to think in terms of a series of things, in the case of biology, a hierarchy of things. We need to think more in terms of a hierarchy of processes. And we need to see things, rather, as just stabilized aspects of processes. And so what do I want to conclude about mechanism? I suggest mechanism gets things back to front. Mechanism tries to explain processes in terms of these fixed things that interact and some outcome comes from their interactions. I think we should explain things in terms of processes. I think that's quite difficult. I think we have to really perhaps make quite a gestalt switch in the way we think about living systems, but I think that's one that is happening, and I think that really, again, gives us a fundamentally new vantage point on what's out there in the world. And just as an example to conclude, I think this is a case where this is obviously true, is the genome. The genome entered our consciousness as the thing that was going to explain how we developed from a cell to a complex being, how we got sick because we developed wrong. It was a really wonderful vision of understanding all these processes by something that was stable, that could be passed on from generation to generation. But the truth is, the genome is not a stable thing. It is itself a process, stabilized massively by all kinds of editing processes and in a much longer time scale by natural selection. So again, I think what we need to look at are the processes that maintain that thing rather than the thing as something that explains the processes. And so what's wrong with mechanism? Well, I think it distracts from, it fails to draw attention to some wonderful features of biological things, their robustness, resilience, the sensitivity to context, plasticity, and much else beside. So I conclude. I think biology is an absolutely fascinating, very rapidly changing field. I suspect nothing has been changing as rapidly in the history of science as contemporary molecular biology. And I think it deserves philosophical attention for many reasons. It tells us fundamental things about what the world is like, what we're like, and also it tells us some fundamental things about what science is like. And of course, I hope, and sometimes it turns out to be true, that biologists will be interested in hearing these kinds of stories and will find that it resonates with what they're doing and sometimes even helps them do what they're doing a little better. So thank you very much.